Hi, and welcome to another edition of NCBI's podcast. My name is Kevin Kelly. I'm the head of policy and advocacy with NCBI. On today's episode, I'm delighted to say I'm joined by Neasa Hourigan TD. Neasa, thank you for joining us on the show.
No problem. I'm very delighted to be here.
You've had a hectic and chaotic 15 or 19 months with being elected to the local authority in the Dáil. It must have been a whirlwind.
It's been a really big change in my life because I had been a lecturer for a few years in architecture, and before that I was a consultant and a kind of a specialist in sustainable design. And then I actually, when my little girl was born, and obviously had additional needs, I took a step back because, I kind of wanted to just focus and make sure that, she got the best start that she could. And so I was home. From like the end of 2016 onwards, basically. I was home in the house. And so to go from that to the Dáil I was a councillor for 9 months and then a TD, that was very fast. And I'm still running to keep up. But, it's a really steep learning curve. But I do love steep learning curves. I love to kind of be challenged. So it's been a very interesting time.
Yeah, great. We might come back to the politics and all of that later in the interview, but you mentioned there that your daughter Edith has a visual impairment, and I was just keen to get your perspectives on being a mum of a child that has a visual impairment, because I think a number of our listeners would be very interested in that.
Well, I think I'm like everybody, is that it's a journey. And like every year is different and every challenge is different. On the day that we're recording this, she's gone back to school and she goes to mainstream school. And so I just find every year, she learns and I learn. Certainly, Edith was my first baby. And so it was, and it was very apparent very early on that there was a significant visual impairment. And I think it was, she was 3 weeks old and it was flagged for us that, she's not focusing. And that's, something when you have a newborn baby, you're kind of worried anyway. Everything is you're on high alert. And so we kind of entered into then a kind of a long period of which a lot of families do. And I don't think that we're good at giving families that support during the time when you're trying to work out what's happening. What that diagnosis point, and it happens in at different times for each child. So for us, it was very early on, kind of by 10 or 12 months, we knew where we were. It was big. It was a big news for us because she would have, let's say, maybe 6 or 7% sight, or less than 10%. We're not really sure what she has, and it's not. There's no treatment for it. So this is we're in it. It's a long-term situation, and I think that for other people, that'll be something that arises when the child is going to school. I see a lot of people, obviously, with visual impairment. Obviously in teenage years and hormone changes, and that sometimes is when it kicks in. So definitely I think it's really difficult for parents sometimes to grapple with all of that and make sure that the child is the focus, and that was for us, this tiny little baby, and we were trying to work out what the best thing to do was. I have to say we were incredibly lucky that we live in Dublin 7 and therefore we were close to Child Vision. And we were in touch with the NCBI, and we just had good support, and and the family has had always such an incredibly positive experience, and I know that's not the same for everyone. So in some ways, I know it's a weird thing to say around disability, and I find myself saying this a lot, but in some ways, like there's great blessings. You always feel kind of quite grateful in certain aspects of it. But yeah, I mean, it's just it's a learning curve, and we're trying to do the best. And now that she's obviously 8, she is part of that discussion, and she's telling us what she wants to do.
I'm sure she is.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, and it's interesting because some of the points that you made there are quite common to a lot of the parents, and it's something that NCBI is quite conscious is being there in the very early days following diagnosis with the introduction of our eye clinic liaison officers in some of the Dublin offices, and funding permitting. We would like to see that extended to having NCBI staff available in the hospice, not in the hospice rather, but in the hospital to support parents on receiving the diagnosis, because I think a lot of people go into shock.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think the reality is that a lot of the service providers and the nurses and doctors who, in fairness, are doing their best. Um, I suppose not many people are dealing with visual impairment. It's still relatively rare, and they might not have seen it, and they might not know what they're looking at. So to have specialists, or to have people who know what they're talking about. I don't even mean people who are at the kind of, I'm not talking about even about consultant ophthalmologists or anything like that. I'm just talking about service providers who've seen it before and know what that looks like. Is incredibly helpful. And I guess the key thing there is that it doesn't become something where it matters where your address is. That, like, you whether you're in Kerry or you're in Monaghan or you're in Dublin 7, you should feel that, like, that know-how, that kind of on the ground know-how is available to you, and there's somebody who's seen it all before. And because that's what I always found the most helpful. Somebody who'd seen it all before, and they were like, just take it easy. Don't be scared. It'll all be fine. I've always found that so great. And if you find people like that, they're a gem. Because in those early days where everything just seems like up in the air, someone telling you, look, there's a pathway forward here, we'll get you sorted, is invaluable.
When preparing for the interview, you've remarked previously that some of your activism work is due to your daughter. I suppose that comes from encountering challenges as you when you became a mum and started interacting with various state services.
Absolutely. And like, I would always be somebody I would have always followed politics, and I would read a paper, and I'm always kind of vaguely interested in it. And obviously, then through my work, because I was a specialist in kind of environmental stuff, which isn't actually the traditional way of getting into the Green Party. Most people are kind of eco activists, but I came through it from a professional point of view, and that's how I got, I suppose, into the sphere of environmental stuff. But actually, all of it was fairly dormant until I had Edith, and I just felt that all of a sudden there was no time to wait. It's a weird thing to kind of get older and get more radical, but I definitely think that really simple things, like one of getting involved in, let's say, how your street is and your community. Like, one of the things I'm very active on is the Irish Pedestrian Network, and helped found that. And that absolutely is rooted in the perspective of accessibility, and that if every street works for somebody with additional needs, then it'll work for all. It'll work for families. It'll work for everyone, and that is absolutely rooted in our experience. Edith would be a white cane user, and we were very lucky that we had a little bit of mobility training when she was 4, and then we were kind of told, well, practice now with the cane. And I'm telling you, there's nothing like walking around with a white cane and a small child and trying to explain to them why the street or the road or the footpath is so bad or the crossing isn't right, to make you realize that this isn't fair. Like, this is just not fair. You shouldn't have to explain to a 4-year-old why the crossing doesn't suit her. And that does kind of radicalize you. It does make you feel like, there's no time to waste. I might as well get up. And we did do things like occupy streets to make them pedestrian for a day, without any permissions, really. I have to be honest. We did do things, like we make lots of submissions, and we're very active. I'm very lucky that there's one started up in Cork now. There's one started up in Limerick. We're looking for anyone who's interested in starting them up. But it's completely based around community. So there isn't kind of one big Irish pedestrian network group. It's the idea that everyone in their community, it's almost like a tidy towns model, is that everybody would do it in their own community, and feed into that decision making. Go and annoy your councillor, go and annoy your TD, and say, look, I need a crossing at my kid's school. I need this footpath to be better or wider or straighter or whatever it is. And that's absolutely born from experience.
Something that I'm interested in getting your thoughts on, because there's always a lot of public discussion and debate around accessibility issues and challenges, and, for example, the introduction of cycleways and paths, and how people with reduced mobility safely navigate shared space. And I'm sure you've lots of thoughts on that from your professional background and being a mum of a child with a visual impairment as well.
Absolutely. I have very strong opinions about it, but I think one of the things I clocked very quickly is that um, all of those active travel issues, we should all band together and we'd be stronger. And that there was an emerging thing of cyclists against pedestrians, and that was being kind of fueled by existing authorities who want, they don't want kind of strong activism. They want it to be divided, and I was very clear that, for example, the Irish Pedestrian Network, or more my little Twitter site, Dublin Blockers, that was all about accessibility. And there is a natural point of conflict between cyclists and pedestrians. There absolutely is, or kind of people in wheelchairs. Like, cyclists go at a much different speed, and it's a different type of infrastructure. So my feeling was always, well, let's put all of that on the table in a constructive way. So a good example would be, for example, bus stops. At the moment in Dublin, they're talking about bringing in where you would situate stops in relation to bus connects. Now, if you're somebody who has a visual impairment and you're trying to get on a bus, the idea that you would have to come off of a footpath, cross a cycle lane to get to a bus stop is really worrying. I can imagine, because I know that with my little girl, a cyclist doesn't have to hit you to rob you of your confidence. If they whiz past you and you don't know that they were coming, that actually takes your confidence. It doesn't have to touch you even to affect that. And so there's natural points of conflict. But I always felt, and at the very early days of setting it up, we reached out to the cyclist groups because they're quite good at lobbying. And I always felt that, like, well, let's all join up together and see if we can work that stuff out and be a stronger group, because it's really, we know historically, and the legacy of all of infrastructure funding in Ireland is all around roads and cars, and that has left us with a situation where people are very reliant on cars even when they don't want to be. And my feeling would be that it should be around choice, and so that instead of spending more than 90% of all of our funds on roads and cars and facilitating that, why don't we do it fairly and with parity? And you know what? If we had good infrastructure of footpaths and crossings, and also cycling infrastructure, there would be choice there, because there's an emerging kind of group within cyclists as well, of disability activists within cycling, which I find so interesting. And I know my little one now, she wants one of the 3-wheel bikes. Now, obviously, we'd have to cycle with her, but if there was a lane that I trusted in Dublin for her, I would be delighted for her to try cycling. And I think that's the test of all infrastructure. Would you put someone who you consider, who you might be worried about, who might be vulnerable, on a lane? So, for me, an 8-year-old with visual impairment and who's also hard of hearing, if I have a bike lane or a path that I'm happy for them to navigate themselves, well, then that's probably good infrastructure.
In your mind, can you see a way forward to lessen some of the concerns amongst people who are blind and vision impaired around what's proposed under Bus Connects on the bus stop islands and having to cross cycle paths, because it is causing a lot of concern, and it's something that NCBI has made a number of submissions on in the last few months?
I mean, I have to say, in that case, I side with the pedestrians there, and I side with people with disabilities. I think that, particularly on the corridors that I'm dealing with in my constituency, there's a kind of a natural kind of slope down into the city centre from Dublin 7. And so when I think of the bus corridors that we're dealing with in places like Stony Batter or places like Drumcondra, and I'm getting very, very specific to my area now, and I do apologise for your listeners, people pick up great speed on bikes. And I know that's great, and I know that you want people commuting, but we have to stick to the kind of basic principles of a street that works for people that is universally accessible. And when we started up the Irish Pedestrian Network, that was one of the key principles that we adopted, is that there's a hierarchy of the street, and the very top of that hierarchy is not just pedestrians, but vulnerable pedestrians who might have, vision impairment, or who might have difficulty walking. I mean, one of the things that we don't add into this group, often enough, if you ask me, actually, is older people who wouldn't be great on their feet. Because my parents, for example, now wouldn't be happy to walk any great distance. They're fine. They're not using walking sticks or anything, but they wouldn't be particularly brilliant on their feet over, a long time. And if you're waiting for a bus, you could be waiting for a while, and therefore to walk out into a cycle lane, you just for a bike to come whizzing past you, I don't think it's viable. And I think, we just have to continue to put pressure on them to take that perspective seriously. If you want people on buses, they have to be able to get onto the bus in a safe way, and that's an equality issue almost.
Yeah, we're on the same page on that one, totally, and hopefully there'll be tweaks made in the coming months, and that all of the campaigning that various organisations and individuals with disabilities will be listened to when it comes to decision time and when plans are put in place. You mentioned earlier that it's returned to school season. How do you think all of that's going at present?
Well, I mean, we'll find out, I guess. I think that y- you know it was late. The amount, as in the amount of information people were getting. I was still getting emails from my kids' school this week, and if you have a child with additional needs, you're again always on high alert to make sure that everything's right for them. I find it, challenging to kind of send her back and not necessarily be able to kind of uh, stand around the yard, even, talking to her SNA and talking to her teacher. Like, that's something that I would have always done in a kind of a casual way, because you'd like to have like good relationships with people, and I've always found that that's a really good way of working with service providers. And I find even that challenging, because I'm like, oh, I don't really know what's going on, or so that bit is hard. I think that the government didn't do a good job in terms of communicating it, and it does feel a little bit last minute, and it won't be clear, I guess, for another few weeks whether or not it has panned out the way we wanted it to. I can only hope that we don't see a spike and that we're not all, in lockdown again. That, I think, that would be really a huge worry.
Yeah, turning to the politics, have you set goals and objectives for your time in Leinster House on things that you would like to see progressed?
I absolutely have. I mean, one of the things that we did get in the program for government is stuff around infrastructure for active travel, and I think that in that we tend to think of that as cycling, and I completely reject that. And 10% of all infrastructure spending should be pedestrianisation and should be accessible. Accessibility in our, not just in our towns and our cities and our villages, but also, in any area where people would wish to walk. I have, been kind of doing lots of research in terms of like, what do other countries do, and other countries have kind of really interesting approaches. Like, for example, the 200-meter rule, which is anywhere around a park or a school, that they have kind of pristine a pristine walking environment with really, really good crossings. And what that means is you have almost a tapestry, where it becomes much easier then to join up good infrastructure between those 200-meter pristine areas. So if you have like a school and a park that's maybe 300 meters away, now you only have 100 meters left of kind of work to do. So I think there's really interesting issues like that. Obviously, I'm the finance spokesperson, so there's kind of issues around budgets and finance that I'm interested in looking at. Uh, I guess, coming from a disability, from a family who has a child that has a disability, I'm interested in the I guess the how Section 38 and 39 organizations are doing and how they're funded. I personally take the view that it's kind of old hat to think of the service provision to people with disabilities as charity. I don't like to get up on my high horse about that, but I don't like to think of that as a charity issue. I think that the state should be providing all of those things, and I think it has knock-on effects to, the way we treat workers in those organizations. So that's a whole area of work that I would like to contribute to, and which I have kind of strong opinions about.
Very good. And finally, on today's program, lots of people are always curious about Leinster House and what goes on in Leinster House. I know you guys are spending some of your time in the convention centre and some time in Leinster House. But as a first-time TD, what's been your first impressions of it all?
Well, I guess I've had a really unique experience because within 2 or 3 weeks of becoming a TD, where you wouldn't even have an office or anything at that stage, and you wouldn't have staff or anything like that. You're kind of you're in the first flush of it. Within that time, then coronavirus started, and so most of Leinster House is kind of locked down. There's no dining area. There's you can get things from the cafeteria, and you have to kind of go back to your office and eat it. And um, uh, somebody told me recently that the bar is open, but I haven't actually seen that. Maybe I'm spending my time doing the wrong things. But I have staff brought on now, and I have to say, having kind of been involved in activism and kind of community work for the last few years, and kind of I'd be looking after the kids all day, and then I'd put them all to bed. I have 3 kids, put them to bed, and then I would take out my laptop and I'd start, emailing people or like researching papers for a submission to the council or whatever it might be. And I have to say, the big change for me is to have support, is to have staff support, and to have the support of, kind of researchers in the Dáil and things like that, where you can kind of go and say, look, I want to do this thing and I have this idea about it. And can we talk about that? And can we move that forward? That's actually, I took fully admit that I'm a big nerd, but that to me is really exciting. And I'm only starting to get to grips with that kind of level of support that you have available. And I do love policy, and I was chair of policy council for the Greens for a good while. And so to have kind of an ability to put together papers and research stuff, I'm quite excited about that. So I'm gonna get really stuck in there, and I guess that's the biggest change for me. I guess the bit that I'm a bit sad about is that I would have loved to bring my dad up to Leinster House and see his daughter be a TD, because I think like it's a big thing for him, and we can't do that in coronavirus. But look, we're all putting stuff off, in the current circumstances, and that's the least of it. As I don't get to see him that much anymore. But yeah, it's pretty quiet in Leinster House. But I would say next week when we get back, it'll start off again. The only other thing I would say is, I know the conference centre is costing an incredible amount of money, and I can assure you that nobody likes being there. You're away from your staff, and you're away from your office and your phone and all of that kind of stuff. And so I think as soon as we can get back to Leinster House, everybody will be much, much happier and much more effective in their work.
Great. Thank you very much for joining us on the NCBI podcast. And maybe you'll come on in a few months again and tell us how you're getting on with all the various initiatives that you're involved in.
Oh, I'd be delighted to. I'd love to do that. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
That was Green Party TD Neasa Hourigan speaking to me, Kevin Kelly, on NCBI's podcast. Remember, tune in to our next edition, and this is available on Amazon, Alexa, Apple, and a number of other platforms. Check out our website, www.ncbi.ie, for further details.